Hey everyone, welcome back to AI Chronicles, and this is the 50th episode of my podcast. And this one's a little extra special. I'm here hanging out with my friend Devinder to talk about AI in education, the magic behind Model Context Protocol, aka MCP, and where learning meets large language models. Hi Devinder, how are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good. Thanks so much for taking your time off from the weekend. And before we get started with the serious questions and whatnot, I have a fun question for you. So,
Okay.
you ready?
hmm
Okay. If you had an AI agent as your personal tutor back in school, what subject would you have made it suffer through with you?
Probably Calc 1. I think it took
Ooh,
me a long time to understand the jump because I skipped trig. So I
okay.
went straight from like algebra to calc, and I had to like learn trig in my off hours. So I'd probably use it for that. And then yeah, that was probably the one tough course. And I've taken like organic chem and like multivariable calc after that, but just the jump to calc was super hard for me.
Why'd you skip trigonometry?
So the way the schools work is if you test really well, you get assigned courses. That's like how my school
Ah,
worked. And I tested too well, and then I failed right into the next part.
excellent.
Hmm.
All right. Okay, that was a fun bit.
Yeah,
Great. Okay. I want to get started with this fun topic that I have in mind for us to chat. So
sure.
let's start from the top. What excites you about AI's role in education today?
There's so many aspects to this, right? There's adult education because a lot of people have to rotate their skills to be able to keep up with the job market. Obviously, a lot of things are happening that the media does cover that, hundreds and thousands of jobs might be at risk. At the same time, the media doesn't cover as much, which I'm a little bit annoyed about sometimes. But I hope we can change together is that a lot of new jobs and new opportunities are being created. We're able to do a lot more with a lot less, and customer expectations are changing. So there's that aspect of it. There's also the schooling, right? Like straight up, what's the role of college now?
Hmm.
And how do teachers adjust their teaching methods where anyone can look up anything? And it's very similar to when people got access to the internet and they didn't have to go to the library as much, right?
Yeah.
They're able to now cite things a lot faster. Cliff Notes was similar if anyone's old enough to remember. But now we have unprecedented access to information in a new way, and teachers have to make another shift.
Hmm.
And then students are trying to figure out how they're going to be relevant in the job market with very static courses. And obviously, all these parts have to move together to come to some kind of equilibrium.
Fair enough. And do you think we are at the beginning of a real transformation or still in that experimental hype zone?
I think both of those have been running concurrently. There's
Mm.
always going to be a ton of hype. I can't tell you, there's every single conference I go to, someone's like, we're going to replace X forever. And then you have a real conversation with the person and they're like, that's just marketing. I'm like, but then
Mm.
why are you saying it? Right?
Yeah.
Because it sells. It sells for better or worse. And companies are very much driven to be the one that sells the most. So, not all of them, but quite a few, right? And so I think there's a lot of hype. At the same time, the amount of things you can do with AI now, even like baseline ChatGPT, the average human being, what they can do is very different, and it changes our ability significantly compared to what we were able to do in a pre-ChatGPT world. Forget
Hmm.
like comparing version 3.5, 4, like we've gotten way, way better at coding, at researching, at doing a bunch of different things. And now we're starting to rethink even like how to start to utilize these tools. And that's where I think the real wins are.
Mm.
Businesses and engineering groups are starting to understand that these aren't deterministic tools. They don't do exactly what you say every single time, but there's a lot of room to be able to work with a technology like that that works really, really well. And the reason for that is humans do the exact same thing. Not
Yeah.
all 10 of the people are going to do this exact thing that you ask them to. There's some variability. And we're surprisingly good at managing that. And it has a lot of use cases.
Fair. And so we talked about like a lot of education, teaching, learning, and whatnot. So how do you see AI changing how we learn versus how we teach?
So many things. So let's talk about learning first. I think the expectation from people across the board is that the breadth of knowledge is going to be a lot broader. I pride myself as a jack of all trades, but it's super easy to be a jack of all trades compared to what it was like back in the day. You really had to like learn a lot to read into a lot of different things. And to get your skill level up where you knew a little bit about a lot of things. And for better or worse, like that's the type of learning that I like to do. Now I'm able to go a step deeper, a lot quicker into a lot more subjects. And it's almost expected that I know the amount of knowledge that I do because I have access to ChatGPT, because I have access to the to the internet. So learning is changing in that the breadth of knowledge changes significantly. We're also changing how we interact with authorities. Like
Yeah.
most of the time, unless you're the type of person, and I have been known to like submit a lot of errata kind of inputs to books and codes, but most of the time, people typically used to believe what's true in a book as the truth, right? And for the most part, with enough editing, all of that worked out really well. Now you have to keep your mind sharp throughout the whole process to make sure that the system you're learning from is not BSing you. And I think that's really, really important as a skill in life in general, but now it becomes an active required skill set at a very young age for pretty much everyone.
Hmm.
And I think that changes the way you learn. The way you teach also changes because now your students have access to all the knowledge. You have to shift how you like what's you have to shift what's really important. You can't get away with just pointing to a chapter in a text. And in fact, the good teachers never did. But let's say the average teacher's requirement is, and it's fair enough that the state requires you to have a chapter done, right? Or if a certification requires you to meet certain criteria and pass a test, pass an online test. Those are fairly poor measures, even in the past, in my opinion, for acuity, because there's ways to cheat, there's ways to come up with answers looking at like a resource on the internet. But now with ChatGPT, it's easier than ever to cheat.
Mm.
And so for an educator, they have to get even more creative about what it means to have learned. And there's some really, really good authors on this subject, like Barbara Oakley has, I think, the largest MOOC online on like how learning how to learn.
Mm.
And I think I picked that up from my Coursera days right around like it popped up the same time that Andrew Ng's course did, I think, for me at least.
Yeah.
But courses like that become a lot more relevant today because it teaches both educators and the people who are learning how to actually learn the subject that they're interested in and how to have that information stick.
Hmm. Fair enough. And are students and educators both benefiting equally, or do you think one is ahead of the curve?
Um, benefiting equally. Tell me more what you mean by benefiting equally.
Like, like you said, that AI is helping, like, especially in the ChatGPT era, it's very easy to, for students, for example, to cheat or, do their assignments or something. But with educators, it's like they do need to, I don't know. I feel like the balance is more skewed towards who are learning, more like students,
Mhm.
than the teachers, because then teachers have to make sure, oh, is this ChatGPT oriented or is that the student who's really working on their assignment?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a
Something
bit
like
of
that. Yeah.
balance to that. No, 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 I
Yeah.
hear you. There's a bit of balance to that. I would say it depends on the person. Certainly, students are typically in the learning stage of their life and they're a little bit more experimental. And the
Mm.
person who's more experimental is going to get more out of experimental tools or tools that are new. But there's plenty of teachers who can utilize their years and years of experience. And then this is the same is true, by the way, for senior software engineers, where the reason that young engineers are having a hard time getting hired as much is because they have to show a new set of skills, whereas senior engineers are leveraging, or in this case, teachers can leverage their deep knowledge of the base to be able to make corrections, to be able to make adjustments, to be able to really utilize these tools well. So
Mm.
the balance shifts depending on the person using the tool. As a whole, I think the folks who are more keen to experimentation are the folks who are going to be um, getting the most out of it. And
Mm.
that typically, for better or worse, tends to be students.
Yeah, I guess so. And do you still hear like the universities, at the universities, if ChatGPT or any such, Claude or any other LLMs, are they still banned? I know because when ChatGPT came around, like a year later, like majority of the universities just literally banned the use of ChatGPT.
Hmm?
Is it still going around like that, or people have become more creative?
I think some university policies are shifting. Some
Mm.
university policies are still stringent. There's also custom ChatGPT like tools that are starting to become approved. There's also
Huh.
specific use cases where just like, back in the day, you can use your calculator for this or you can't use your calculator for
Yeah.
this. same kind of deal is happening. You can use ChatGPT for this and or Claude for this and not for that. Um, and I think that's reasonable enough. Like that's just how it's going to move. I am working with a couple of board of eds, local board of eds, where we're trying to train both teachers and students to be able to expand some of the use
Mm.
cases for the tooling and really try to understand when it's actually not just blindly expand, but when it's actually providing real help for the students, when it's helping the educators themselves, and when it actually increases the scope of like what they're able to do and gets them to their learning goals.
Can you give us any example?
Yeah, a lot of community colleges are revisiting like existing certifications they have to see if
Mm-hmm.
they're still relevant, if they can be augmented using something like ChatGPT. There's grade schools that are also considering that ChatGPT exists. We're not allowing it in classrooms yet, but we'd like to be able to provide a meaningful interaction for the students, especially if it helps us achieve more learning goals. Does it help us? Because every school has like learning goals. A lot of even the state gives you a certain amount of requirements for what student needs to be able to do, and educators are beginning to see that there might be paths to uh, utilize these tools not just to help them, grade a little bit better with a little bit more precision, but also to map their lesson plans to these learning goals and then to achieve more of the results for a broader set of students because there's a lot of underlying things, right? There's teachers, there's never enough teachers. Like there's so many schools out there that um, just are struggling to keep the
Right.
number count like in balance. And one of the things that something like Claude or LLM has the opportunity brings the opportunity to do is not only allow you, a teacher to have a little bit more interaction with the tool so that the tool itself helps the students more, so they're getting some kind of quasi personalized attention, but it's
Mm.
also possible for students who don't, or at least students who feel they don't learn a certain way, to have more
Mm.
options.
Mm.
And that expansion can help teachers become better educators.
That's a great example. This is question not related, not exactly related to the topic that we had in mind, but do you
Mhm.
think like the job interviews in the tech industry, are they changing or
Oh
they're
man, they
still being
should.
like the traditional one?
No, there's a lot of both. Um, I know this as someone who helps a lot of people with their interviews, has gone through couple of interviews myself, who's working with potentially a few companies who are changing the way that they see as that interviews need to be. And so there's
Mhm.
like 100 startups in the space. They're going to
Yeah.
revolutionize interviews forever. And then there's a lot of legacy stuff that already exists in the market where large companies still want you to be able to, do a red black tree sometimes by
Mm.
yourself without any help. So I think there's a lot of tug of war happening in that space. My perfect scenario for this is that in a few years we realize that the method that the person behind the interview or like the interviewee
Mm.
utilizes to approach a problem and the kind of semantic behavior they display when they're problem solving is a lot more important and is a much better key indicator in addition to the things that they're actually doing with their life, like what they're doing on. You and I use LinkedIn a lot.
Mm.
Both of us are in communities. What are they doing outside of like their immediate work that might make them better candidates? And it doesn't have to be exactly related to work, but how are they involved in their life and stuff like that? That holistic picture, I think, is like the perfect role for me for like this is the candidate and this is their whole story. And it'll also hopefully help against a lot of other problems in interviews. Like you can automate sending job listings, and even if all of them are
Yeah.
not necessarily true, and you can automate sending your resume to job listings. And now it's just AIs versus AIs on like who can spam the other the most, and
Yeah.
that's problematic.
Very, very problematic. Okay. All right. So, yeah, sorry. I changed the gear a little bit there. But
No worries.
getting back to now, I want to hear about MCP, especially for listeners that are who are new to it. Can you tell us what is Model Context Protocol and why is it relevant now?
So the big problem with the definition of MCP that I've seen, and I love Anthropic and the original paper and everything about it, except for this one line where they compare it to USB-C, and I
Yeah.
think throws everyone off because I've heard that definition from so many people. Oh, it's like a USB-C for like your LLMs to be able to talk
Mm.
to your applications. And when you dig into it a little bit deeper, no one really knows how to explain it. So the thing that MCP allows you to do, like the Model Context Protocol, is essentially a way for your LLMs to have context, right?
Mm.
Or in a unified way for you to be able to communicate with your LLMs and give them context for your applications. What does that mean? You can make specific tool calls available that the LLM can actually utilize with very specific inputs, outputs, right?
Mhm.
You can add a little bit of structure around that. You can add documentation that effectively acts as a RAG, but for something very specific. People use like I don't know, GitHub Copilot. GitHub, the whole thing, as well as I think Vercel. There's a bunch of these applications that exist where if you want to make a pull request in a uniform way, if you want to make a code suggestion in a uniform way, if you want to automate something, but there's associated tools that already have all of these tool calls and this documentation and knowledge effectively acts like RAG because that's becoming added to the context, right?
Mhm.
Um, but all of this in one place for a certain type of tool. And when that becomes useful in a very practical way is if you have 10 different departments that have access to different layers of data and they need to be able to communicate with each other and they need their LLMs to be able to communicate with each other, something like Model Context Protocol gives you like a backbone for all of that. So it's not necessarily about just like transferring data from one place to the other. It's not necessarily like having just an API, like an LLM layer on top of an API, and some of that is confusing because there's like tool calling and all of that. But it's just a protocol that standards how applications provide context to LLMs.
Mm.
Anywhere that would have been useful, anywhere where communication could have been improved, anywhere where dynamic tool exposure can be uniform. Like you don't want different people writing different sort of inputs outputs for dynamic tool calls for their different LLMs across an organization or across specific tools. Um, or and you want to be able to like sort of see what's going on in sort of a uniform way rather than everyone slow cooking their own solutions and diverging in that way. All
Mhm.
it is a protocol that allows you to do that. And a really clean example of that is in tool calls. A really clean example of that is in shared data that effectively acts like RAG, but you have one source of truth. And that's where the server component comes in. I
Mhm.
see a frown, so help me understand what I can say a little bit better.
I think I got lost a little bit somewhere where you mentioned like shared data. So if you can like elaborate there a little bit, that will be helpful. What do you mean by that?
So if you use something like, let me think about this. So you know about RAG.
Yeah.
Essentially, you have a document store.
Yep.
It gives you the right context based on
Mm-hmm.
your lookup.
Yeah.
Um, and you let's say you built an agent for yourself that does that. You built
Mm-hmm.
an agent for your whole department that does that, but you need to expand it out to greater parts of the organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could do that with MCP without having to expose anything more than like a very specific set of things.
Mm-hmm.
Anything more than like what you tell like a specific MCP tool to be able to do. And that's why I think examples like GitHub are really, really nice. Um, Another example use case might be compliance training, right?
Okay.
You are able to do anything you can do with RAG, you can do with MCP. Now,
Mm-hmm.
add on top of that tool calls that are also structured. There's like new features coming out for MCP2s that'll allow even more stuff. But tool calls are my favorite because now I have specific data, let's say documentation for a specific API, and the ability to call through that um, in directly with the LLM. And
Mm-hmm.
this is where it gets muddled, where people are like, "Oh, that's very much like giving like that's pretty much like another layer for APIs." And the
Yeah.
thing is, another layer for APIs suggests that it's still doing that deterministic thing. Another layer of APIs is suggesting that your LLM with like an MCP plan isn't going to still have that probabilistic component where like it is deciding when to make the tool call in response to your request. Another layer for API doesn't take into account that you can actually customize the documentation or whatever it is that you're feeding um, as like a general broader context and like not just one LLM because I think Google supports it, Open AI supports it, and adoption is a huge part of this. All of these different LLMs can take the same layered context that you have. They can all, you don't have to create different like adapters for all of them, and then still be able to interact with your application there.
Got
Is
it.
that a little bit better?
That yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that's where that USB-C comparison or the analogy comes in when you mention the word adapters, like you don't have to create adapters for every application or every tool that you want. I guess that's where people are thinking more like, okay, yeah, it's like USB-C, you connect your phone, laptop, iPad, whatever. Maybe.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. There's, I would say that's fair. I just find myself going to the hardware side of things as soon as I hear like USB-C. And
Yeah.
to me, it's not a great way to describe what's going on. Like there's a little bit of bidirectional communication that's happening. Like one of the cool MCP examples that I like to use was actually built by a friend I made at a hackathon. And essentially, you could build tools on the fly. You could generate a color palette, and this was actually like a fun Electron app that built into the browser where you could say, okay, you color pick some colors. You say, I want to build an application with these colors, and it generated that application on the fly. And then you
Mhm.
say, I want to make some changes to it. Maybe have the application generate a new type of criteria and create a third application using the two criteria now that I've built as applications, this color
Ah.
picker and like this new gradient thing that I've generated. These need to inform whatever my third application looks like. So there's like this cool bi-directional communication thing going on.
Mhm.
If there's a means, and I forget if this is already available because it's been like a month or so, but I think this is available. You can create something that looks like a stateful session for each
Mhm.
server that's sitting, right? Like if you're able to update your data, if you have documentation that you can update, this is not just like static documentation that you have. It's not just like a specific session that you have. You actually have a server essentially. So use
Mhm.
it like a server. You can create something that looks like state and get a little bit more creative with how you actually move forward in like the lifetime of that server, if that's something that you want to enable.
Mhm.
Security is starting to get better in that space too. Data isolation is only going to get better. I think they have more and more compliances coming. Certainly, implementations that are the easiest ones to use, like FastMCP, are adopting them very, very quickly. And in fact, I think if you go to some official tutorials,
Mhm.
they're actually starting to point to FastMCP as like the implementation to use,
Fast
including,
MCP, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, like including Anthropic.
So fast MCP is a separate concept now? Like
I thought
fast
that.
API and all that?
Uh, yeah. It's. Am I getting the name wrong? I think it's called FastMCP. No, it's not Fast API. Yeah. It's a very easy thing to confuse. It's just a library that allows you to make
Oh,
MCP
okay.
calls, create
Okay.
MCP
Okay.
servers. You create that tool calling with like
Mhm.
very nice decorators that like it's one-liners essentially.
Okay. I really thought there was a new concept on top of MCP. I'm
No,
like,
no, no,
okay, I'm
no,
not caught up yet.
no. It's just an implementation of the protocol
Okay.
working.
Okay.
Right.
Cool. Thanks. That was good examples and good definition to understand MCP for sure. Now, just one
Yeah, I
last
fear I've
question.
left you with a lot of editing for how I like ran through the circle of like those explanations.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, one last question for you, Dee. What advice do you have for folks building AI-powered learning tools or even agents? And the follow-up to that is, are there any common pitfalls to avoid, especially when one is working with real student data and learning patterns?
One more time.
Yep,
I'm not sure
sorry.
I understand the whole question.
Okay, I'll separate it out. So first question here is that what advice do you have for folks who are building AI-powered learning tools or agents?
Um, Figure out what you actually want to do. Don't create. No, like it's true because people create weird goals like, oh, this must always give answer X. And that's not unique to people building agents. That's unique to people who've been dealing with deterministic inputs, outputs, and testing their stuff in a way that only allowed you to have very this singular dimension of analysis, which allowed you to either do a thing or not, right? People in hardware are a little bit more immune to that, but basically figure out what kind of risks you're okay with, create a
Mm-hmm.
risk profile for your application. Risk-based analysis is a really well-documented thing in like FPA and other regulated fields. So just pick up text from that, figure out how people deal with failures, and
Mm-hmm.
incorporate some of that into your agentic planning and your evals and all of that. Because if you don't start thinking about evals as part of your experimentation process rather than as very directed like testing mechanism, you're not going to have good evals, which means you're setting yourself up for a much worse agent or application, even if it does some things well, than you could potentially have. And all that means is have a goal, don't make
Mm-hmm.
unrealistic goals, map to the business or whatever fun use case that you have of the things that actually need to happen. Figure out the things that aren't always going to happen. Evaluate the risk and determine whether you're okay with the level of risk or if you need to do something to actually make changes so that because that risk is unacceptable,
Mm-hmm.
and then test.
Got it. And the follow-up to that, I think, which partly you covered in your answer just now, but I'll still ask, are there common pitfalls to avoid, especially when working with real student data and learning patterns? Student data, let's stick to that.
Privacy, number one, I think.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Um, yeah, because there's this temptation to learn a lot from student data, but de-identify, do the things you're supposed to do if
Hmm.
you're going to try to learn from student data, especially. And then you had another question uh,
Oh,
baked into
just
this.
mainly just the student data, like if there are any common pitfalls to avoid.
Um, these are the same pitfalls that you would try to avoid as a
Yeah,
computer scientist or even as a machine learning engineer. Don't like overfit,
yeah.
right? And you'll start to see that in your results for your bots. It's sometimes very fun to see this happening in the LLM side where they'll always have one answer for like a class of questions. And you're like, I'm sure I didn't do anything that should lead us in that direction, but how is this happening? And then you have to sort of work your way backwards to see either your prompt or like if you've done some reinforcement work or if you've added something in your RAG settings, if you've added like even like temperature and stuff like that can make a difference. But you really have to evaluate every piece of the pipeline and not overfit and be good about de-identifying and certainly keep your mind open to actually going through outputs for different
Mm-hmm.
students so that
Mm-hmm.
you're constantly re-evaluating because no there's so many scenarios we can talk about where like one batch of student is very different from another batch of students and your current existing solutions might work really well for one batch but not for another, so it's a constant update, change, adapt.
Yep, very well said. Thank you so much. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Dee, for the great conversation on MCP and education and everything in between.
Yeah,
And
you're welcome,
dear
thank you for having
listeners,
me.
it was my pleasure. And dear listeners, if you enjoyed this, make sure to follow AI Chronicles for more stories at the intersection of humans, learning, and intelligent systems. Thank you, everyone.